So the first thing to be aware of, the first tip to be aware of when you do autumn landscape photography is that the different species of trees change from their summer dress to their autumn dress at different times over the season. So because the different species of trees change their colors at different times, you generally have something to photograph over the entire period of autumn. And in that way you can aim to photograph the different species of trees and vegetation as they change their colors. For some of the most known trees, you'll generally see silver birches change first, followed by beech trees and then oak trees. And in the mid-latitudes, you'll generally see most autumn colors between September and November. And personally, I found that over the past years, mid-October to mid-November are the peak weeks. Be aware though that when the different vegetation changes colors also differ a bit from year to year, and that comes down to the combination of the amount of precipitation and temperature. So the second tip is of course to seek out fog, because fog is the holy grail for forest photography, and generally when you do autumn photography you want to also include some kind of vegetation, some kind of trees. So fog can help produce atmospheric and dreamlike photos, but compositionally it works fantastic to also help separate the trees throughout the scene. Some of my favorite apps and weather services to help me find and be notified about fog is Viewfinder and Windy, that also has a layer, just like Viewfinder does, where you can see where the fog is predicted. My personal favorite, because I'm a Dane, is the Danish Meteorological Institute, DMI. I find that they are a bit more conservative in predicting fog than both Viewfinder and Windy, but they are generally also more precise. So if you're Danish and the Danish Meteorological Institute does predict fog, chances are that there's a good chance of fog. And finally, the app Clear Outside is generally also good at predicting fog. So 2 composition tips for this third tip, all about composition. And the first is to use a telephoto zoom to zoom in to the beautiful small scenes. Keep it simple. It can be something like hanging autumn leaves against a lake. It can be autumn leaves on a small bush against a waterfall. It can be identifying and zooming into interesting shapes of tree trunks. And you may ask, what is an interesting tree trunk, Mads? Well, personally, I generally find that oak trees and in some cases beech trees have a very gnarly character that I personally like to photograph. Besides that, look for balance, look for depth, and look for what you find to be pleasing patterns. And secondly, no doubt what makes autumn photography so special is of course the colors. Look for differences in color like orange and blue. Look for color that stands out relative to its surroundings. And look for color that can symbolize the gradation from summer to autumn. Warmer colors also have a tendency to come forward in space, whereas colder colors have a tendency to retreat in space. And this has the effect that warmer colors tend to pop more than colder colors. I cover the most important along with some less discussed compositional tools, not rules, about composition in my ebooks all about composition in landscape photography. In the last chapter, I put it all together and analyze some of my own photos and break down why those photos work. With minimal text and tons of examples, they're super easy to read and I make sure to get to the point fast. In my latest ebook, All About Light, I cover everything you need to know about how to use light and color to make the most incredible photos possible. You can get the ebooks either standalone or bundled up, and if you're in doubt about whether you want them or not, you can get the 3 free light versions by subscribing to my newsletter in the description of the video. One of the most powerful tools that we have available as landscape photographers is a polarizing filter. A polarizing filter cuts out polarized light. Polarized light is generally reflected light on water, wet or even dry leaves and rocks or stones. By removing this light, you remove distractions such as highlights and glare from those surfaces, with the result of bringing out more of the saturation in the scene and focusing your composition. So because the polarizing filter removes or decreases a reflection, it's very important that you use it with intention. So if you aim to create a reflection of, let's say, a autumn tree in a lake or something like that, then using a polarizing filter is not the best idea. The next tip is to go close, zoom in, and do macro photography. During autumn, there are so many small details in the forest floor or on trees. It is not something I personally delve a whole lot into, but my friend and colleague Albert Dross has some amazing macro photos, and you can see some of his work in his macro gallery on his website. It is beneficial to have a lens with a good minimum focusing distance and macro capabilities to do this kind of photography, and the main technique is simply to get low, so you're in eye height with whatever you find in the forest floor. Be sure to follow Albert's work here on YouTube, on Instagram, and on Facebook. So the sixth tip here may sound a little bit counterintuitive, but I think it's very important that you do not get blinded or try to overperform during autumn season and only focusing on the autumn colors. Because fact of the matter is, during autumn, there are so many other cool things to photograph. For example, during this time of year, the Milky Way is basically turned vertical and straight up, making for some awesome compositions when lining it up with different foregrounds. As of October 2025, several comets should become more or less visible with the camera, just like last year where comet Chukintian visited during October. Not to mention, we these years have increased Aurora activity, which for my personal preference takes priority over autumn colors. Back on October 1st, I finally managed to experience the boats in Northern Lights reflection phenomenon, and I captured this series of photographs. As I stayed out until after midnight, I decided to skip sunrise despite fog being predicted. And maybe there's a lunar or solar eclipse happening. Fact is that there is just plenty of other stuff to photograph beyond autumn colors. Some of my personal favorite photos were taken during autumn, but don't contain any classic autumn colors. So a seventh tip that may also sound counterintuitive is to use the autumn colors to create striking and powerful and also timeless black and white photos. When converting photos to black and white, you can use the different presets in Camera Raw or Lightroom to get an interesting starting point, and from there use the black and white mixer to control the brightness of the different color channels. It makes for some gorgeous and high contrast photos. And the eighth tip, which is also an editing tip. As autumn vegetation is generally warm, I like to play with the white balance and make the surroundings more blue. So what I do is to actually use a colder white balance. I decrease the temperature of the white balance and then use the HSL sliders to control the warm colors and make them as bright and saturated as I like. But with all editing, it is important to make sure that you do not clip the color channels and lose the texture details in the leaves, and make sure to also respect the light so you don't have luminescent leaves. And finding that balance between luminance, texture, and color can require a few tries to not look it too unreal. I actually have an entire full tutorial on how to edit an autumn photo, another on how I make a monochrome photo, and one on how I edit a moody and atmospheric forest scene as part of my big post-processing course, Photoshop for Landscape Photographers. If you want to learn how to edit your photos, be sure to enroll, as it is 20 plus hours and 30 plus videos where I teach you all my techniques, from the most basic of actually using the programs, over masking, cleaning your photos, focus stacking, dodging and burning, adding and controlling glow and atmosphere, to advanced blending of different exposures with or without using luminosity masking. It really is the best and biggest course on landscape photography post-processing, with the most bang for the buck available, and you can even get a $45 discount by using the coupon code that you can find down in the description of the video along with a link to my ebooks on light and composition. I alluded a little bit to the 9th tip here in the beginning of the video, but make sure to get out on wet days. Wet leaves are so much more contrasty and saturated. The wetness really brings out the colors of the leaves in a way that dryness generally don't do. This is actually also the case during spring and summer. And because the photo is all about the colors actually create the necessary contrasts for an interesting photo, so you don't necessarily need the direct light. This also means that overcast days often work just as good, and in some cases even better, than days with direct side or backlight. And finally, the 10th and maybe even the most important tip: look for subjects that work well with autumn colors and helps elevate the story of your photo. A subject doesn't have to be a tree or a bush or some other kind of vegetation. Personally, I really like to include or actually make my photographs about a non-landscape subject, and then make my autumn colors or the landscape secondary. It could be a little yellow house complementing the autumn colors in a forest. It can be different kinds of birds on a lake like ducks or swans. It can be a human subject going for a walk in an autumn forest, or a beautiful stag among the trees. Us Danes even have access to the deer garden just north of Copenhagen, where you can experience white stags, which are just so fairy tale-ish and just adds the perfect subject to an atmospheric autumn scene. Be sure to get my ebooks on composition and light if you want to learn much more about how to use that in your landscape photography, and be sure to enroll in my huge post-processing course, Photoshop for Landscape Photographers, if you want to learn how to respect the light, make your photos pop, and avoid all the fatal editing mistakes I see most beginners do. There are links to everything down in the description of the video. See you next time.